Hi, everyone. I am going to kick off on time, and I know that will probably mean that we'll have some stragglers coming through because but I'm very mindful that we're all very pressed for time. So I want to make sure that I honour everybody's commitment. So can you believe it is week 24? We are absolutely halfway through the year. Halfway through the year, that is 2024. So I am pinching myself. And I've just got back. This is my first week back from 2 week sitting weeks. The first of those sitting weeks actually started on a Tuesday. We had a late start to the week because there was a public holiday down in Canberra. And then we went through till last Thursday was when I came home. It was another really busy time, and there were some really important pieces of legislation that were debated and significant issues that I know concern our community that were either progressed or raised and put on the boil with the current government. I'm going to go through it by trying to hone in on our key policy areas. And forgive me, I'm actually going to, because I'm going to hone in on the policy pillars, it means I'm going to jump around a bit in terms of weeks. It's not chronological. So the last couple of times I've done it more chronologically. Tonight, I'm actually going to focus in on policy areas, and we'll see if that works for everybody. So on the climate front, it's been a massive focus in the last 2 weeks because it's really been all about whether or not the government was going to deliver on the EPBC reform that we'd expected to see from them. So we saw this government come to power 2 years ago, committing to us that they would lead the reform of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act. Many people in our community are really well informed when it comes to the Graham-Samuels review. So we're very aware of what it was that we'd been told needed to be done in the terms of better nature protection. Really disappointingly, what we've seen is that the government's come forward with what they're calling tranche 2. So they've now decided there's 3 tranches in terms of driving this reform forward. The second tranche of reform will include the establishment of a body called the Environment Protection Australia and another body called Environment Information Agency. So from my perspective, a lot of the time in the last 2 weeks had been working with not only external stakeholders, so I particularly want to acknowledge the work of the Wilderness Society and the Environmental Defenders Office in terms of working with myself and my team to actually trawl through that legislation to see where there might be areas that we believe the community of North Sydney will want to see amendments. And there are. The 2 pieces of legislation are not perfect. I do think the 2 pieces of legislation are a step in the right direction, but my concern remains much the same as it was when the Nature Repair Bill was introduced last year, and that is without the new national environment standards, it's very difficult for any new agency or any new market to actually be effective. You have to know the standards that you're seeking to uphold. And the truth of the matter is, to establish an EPA at the moment makes sense because it lets us get all the bureaucracy in place. But unfortunately, it'll only be upholding bad laws at the moment. And so we do need the government to prioritise the development of the new national standards. From our point of view, then, we're working really closely with the Minister and her team to advocate for a number of amendments that focus in on 2 key areas. And those 2 key areas are actually community engagement and representation. So making sure the EPA has a responsibility to listen directly to community, not just taking it as given by the proponents that advocacy work's been done. And secondly, to make sure that there's transparency and accountability around how the EPA is making its decisions. So what information have they taken on board and how did they come to the decision that they've made? So the conversations with the Minister's team at the moment to date have been reasonably positive. And so I think, I want to thank my team. Audrey, you guys know, as my senior advisor here, is doing great work with them, really advocating for these amendments to make the legislation stronger. The second really important piece that we saw move through the House in the last 2 weeks is the Net Zero Economy Agency legislation. Now, this legislation has now passed the House of Reps. Oh, there go the lights. Just so everybody is really clear, the legislation here establishes a new authority which will be tasked with managing our economy going forward. So my main concern with that entity as it currently exists is that it's very focused specifically on people who work in either a gas or a coal energy sector at the moment. And by that, I mean specifically in the plants. Myself and others on the crossbench argued really hard with the government that if they were going to establish this authority, they should ensure that this authority was fit for purpose to help guide our entire economy over the course of the next decade, not just focus in on one sector for the next 3 years. So look, as a country girl, I know what happens when you take an industry out of a small town. You know, I saw the town of Binnaway is not very far from Coonabarabran. Binnaway was once a thriving community, but with the collapse of the rail network, Binnaway has been reduced to a handful of families these days. So I joined forces with Helen Haynes down in Canberra to really argue for the fact that this authority should have a better focus on the broader ramifications for any community. So how should small businesses be supported? How should health services be supported? How should schools be supported as they go through this transition? And I think our arguments were heard by the government. We weren't successful in getting the legislation amended, but we certainly put them on notice that we will be following very closely to see what impact that authority can have in terms of shaping our economy in a really positive way. We then also saw the climate disclosure legislation, which introduces compulsory climate reporting for a range of businesses across Australia. Now, I want to be really clear from the outset here, we are a long way behind. There are a number of other markets, including the EU and America, that have had climate disclosure reporting for a period of time. And so that debate was interesting because while some argued that big business here in Australia would need time to adjust to this new reporting process, I came out hard and said, actually, the majority of the businesses that this reporting process will impact are already doing it in other markets. And therefore, we should ask them to move faster to be able to adopt this new reporting format. Again, I think it went down really well. And it was interesting for me to see the engagement that I actually was able to have with organisations like the Business Council of Australia and the Council of Small Businesses, COSBOA, who are really actively engaged when it comes to speaking to me about the things that they'd like to see advocated for businesses in Australia. I also attended a number of really interesting briefings in the climate space. And one I wanted to draw to your attention in particular was one that looked at not only what role gas would play in our economy moving forward, but actually what impact seismic testing is having, offshore seismic testing is having on our marine life. The speakers at that event included people like Dr. Ryan Day, who is from the Institute of Marine Antarctic Studies, and Josh Rusiman from the Institute of Economic Energy and Financial Analysis. There's also Louise Morris from the Australian Marine Conservation Society was there in the room. And I've got to say, it was actually Lewis who blew my mind, because he shared with us the fact that we are frequently told the reason we have to keep extracting gas here in Australia is that we need to meet our international community obligations. So there's international contract obligations. What was shared with me in that meeting was Japan, as one of our primary markets for export commitments, actually doesn't use the gas itself domestically. Japan is buying our gas at a cheaper price, and then they are selling it on to other countries. So I think what's really important about understanding this debate as we move forward is when governments or major parties are telling us they need to open new fields for specific purposes, we have to hold them to account on what those purposes are and whether they're being fully transparent with us. At the moment, there's still a lot of smoke and mirrors being used in this space when it comes to fossil fuel extraction. So I'm still working really hard to clear that space so we can be, have a very clear understanding of what's being used by what. I've got to say, on the climate front, perhaps the most joyful thing I did in the last fortnight is I actually met with the Knitting Nanas out on the front lawn of Parliament House. And I just want to let everybody know the Knitting Nanas are massive fans of the community of North Sydney, because they think we've been very brave in taking this course of action to send it independent, and they're excited to see the stuff that we've been able to achieve. If I come from climate then into cost of living, again, there were a number of things that were discussed. The government introduced new legislation to realise all of their budgeted commitments to the social services space. And I took the opportunity to actually call that reform out as wholly inadequate. 1 in 8 Australians is currently living in poverty. 3 million Australians and one of the richest countries in the world do not have enough money to put food on the table. They are making decisions about whether they buy food or medicines, whether they turn their heaters on or their lights on. And disappointingly, the government made a lot of noise out of their budget about how much work they were doing in this space. So it was a real privilege for me to join with ACOS to be able to raise this in the Parliament in the last fortnight. And not only did I actually raise it in the context of talking about the new legislation that the government was trying to introduce, I then actually also asked a question of the Treasurer during question time, because the real kicker here is that we do have a committee in place that this government established. It's an economic advisory committee. And for 2 years in a row now, one of the top recommendations of that economic advisory committee has been that the government should lift the rate of job seeker to 90% of the pension. For 2 years in a row, the government has chosen to ignore its own committee's recommendations. And so that was the question that I put to the Treasurer as to how did he justify continuing to ignore those recommendations. What I will tell you is what was really interesting was the number of people from the backbenches of the Labor Party who came up to me after I'd asked that question in question time and thanked me for asking it. So I think there's a fair bit of pressure going on in the Labor Party at the moment in terms of what we are doing to help those most vulnerable in our community. On women's economic security, there were a number of meetings with the Attorney General specifically in the last fortnight, specifically looking at what role the Australian federal government sees itself playing when it comes to the support of legal services. I'm sure no one on this call tonight will be surprised to know that the vast majority of cases that make their way through to free legal services in Australia are currently women seeking assistance, either fleeing a situation of domestic violence or trying to move proactively before a situation in family and domestic violence escalates. I'm fascinated. In the last 2 weeks, I learnt that with all of that said, 80% of the women who are experiencing family or domestic violence are never coming into contact with our legal system. They're not presenting to police. They're not being caught up in the numbers. Hence why we seem to have this tsunami of cases at the moment that nobody is prepared to deal with. A lot of the advocacy then that we're doing at the moment, myself and others on the crossbench, is actually trying to show the government that they do have the social license to provide money to the legal services to continue to support these people. So watch this space. We are advocating for greater financial support for legal services in the mid-year, so MyEFO. If that comes through, I will have played a really active role in achieving that. I also co-hosted a roundtable discussion down in Parliament in the last 2 weeks under the auspices of Women in Work, with a focus on menopause-friendly work environments. And it was such an interesting conversation because it actually brought out the economic impact of menopause in our society. Just an interesting fact, the average age of women leaving the workforce in Australia at the moment is as low as 52. Somewhere between 52 and 56. By comparison, men stay in the workforce through till 67, 68. And when the body that I co-hosted that event did the work around this, one of the key contributing factors to women leaving the workforce is actually managing their menopause symptoms. So, well, I'll continue to do some work in that space, just looking at whether or not there is legislative reform that we can bring in to make work environments more encompassing for Australians at all stages of their life. Which kind of gives me a nice pivot to human rights. There was so much happening in the human rights space in the last 2 weeks. The first thing I want to talk about is the NDIS reform piece, and I know we're very lucky to have had a couple of people in our electorate actually work directly on the creation of that legislation. So it's been really interesting to see how that legislation has proceeded, and I scrutinised it really closely, not only with locals, but also with Senator Jordan Steele-John from the Greens at the parliamentary level. The legislation that left the House of Reps is definitely in better shape than it was first tabled. Again, myself and others on the crossbench worked with the Minister there, Bill Shorten, to bring forward a number of areas of concern, whether that was about the length of time that people had to appeal assessments, whether it was the way people were going to be reassured that they could still work with those people that they wanted to. And the Minister Shorten was actually quite receptive to those amendments. So I think in the end, we moved about 18 amendments in total. About a quarter of those were successful in getting up at the House level. I expect we'll see more of them actually adopted at the Senate level, because there is a Senate inquiry currently underway. So once that Senate inquiry's findings come back, I think we'll see changes. Perhaps for me, one of the most exciting things was the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, of which I'm a member, you guys know, finally tabled our report into the results of an inquiry into whether Australia would be a better place if we have a Human Rights Act. And overwhelmingly, the testimony that we heard and the submissions we received were very supportive of Australia adopting a Human Rights Act. To be clear, Australia is the only Western nation in the world who does not have a Human Rights Act. Most of our human rights protections at the moment are actually either based on the Magna Carta, so they're assumed protections, they're not written into domestic law, or they're actually framed as anti-discrimination legislation rather than a focus on positive rights. In fact, we have very few positive rights, and there are only 4 positive rights written into our Constitution, one of those positive rights being the right to vote, although we had to add women later down the track. The whole process of tabling that report was really interesting because, as I said, the vast majority of testimony that we received was favourable. It's 96%, I think it was. Only 4% dissented, yet the opposition chose to come out with a dissenting report and completely kiboshed the idea of adopting a Human Rights Act. I don't know what committee hearings those opposition members were sitting in. I don't know what testimony they read. I really felt that their dissenting report was probably written before we even started the inquiry, and then they just pulled it out of the top drawer at the end of the inquiry, because while they used religious discrimination concerns, what I'm really happy to tell you all is that we did have a number of pieces of testimony from people who originally approached with some concern the idea of a Human Rights Act, but by working with those people either during the hearings or in follow-up correspondence, we were actually able to get almost 100% consensus that a Human Rights Act would be a positive thing for all of us. So it's really disappointing to see that the opposition took that chance to promote through division rather than drive unity. Our next inquiry under that committee has now been announced, and we'll actually be doing an inquiry on looking at income management in Australia and whether it is effective and whether it's being applied fairly. So I'm looking forward to getting involved in that. Also in the area of human rights, I participated in a number of activities looking at how we could support Australians experiencing eating disorders. And one of the things I would say is that as I communicated around that work back across our electorate, the feedback that I got from the electorate was overwhelming. It's very clear that we have an issue with eating disorders across our community, that issue ranges everything from the triggers to it through to support for regaining health. And so I think this is an area that we still have a lot of work to do. And it ties nicely with the focus that I've had since before we won the seat, which is around youth mental health. What more can we be doing in this space? So I'm looking forward to continuing to work with people right across our community there. The conflict in Gaza continues to be a primary focus whenever I'm on the ground in Canberra, because it is really the main opportunity to be able to eyeball all of the ministers and the key decision makers at the government level. And so in the last fortnight, I had the opportunity to meet with a number of ministers, including the Foreign Minister and the Assistant Foreign Minister, and departmental folk, and also security services folk, to really get a clearer understanding of what actions the Australian government has been taking and what more we can do. In all of those meetings, I was a very vocal advocate for Australia continuing to reiterate our commitment to the international rule of law and to ensure that we continue to support entities like the United Nations, the ICC and the ICJ, so that any attempts to intimidate or distort the direction of those agencies can actually be countered by a voice of reason. I actually, the other thing I did while I was down there is I met with a group of doctors who have recently returned from Gaza. There were 3 doctors who'd been working with MSF on the ground, and actually being able to hear from them very directly about what they witnessed and what they are seeing take place was invaluable. I was able to then take that information with me back into the meetings I was having with those people that I just talked to you about, to really push them on how much we are seeing and what avenues we are taking to try and bring this conflict to an end as quickly as possible. I think I was reassured that the Australian government is working through all of our diplomatic channels to apply as much pressure as we possibly can to bring this conflict to an end. Bringing that conflict to an end obviously involves getting the immediate release of all remaining hostages. Importantly, it involves an immediate ceasefire, and it involves getting humanitarian aid into the spaces where people need it on the ground there. So it's disappointing to see that the peace deal that had been put forward by America is yet to be accepted by both parties. I know when I was down there last week, that was very much the hope of the government, and that's why Australia had come out and supported a UN resolution and come out very publicly saying they supported the UN brokered deal. I think at this stage, I'm continuing to stay connected to those people that I know in the government can provide me with accurate information, and then doing everything I can to facilitate harmony across our community. So to provide support for those people who feel threatened, but also to provide compassion to all of us who are feeling distraught by what we're seeing happening. In that basis, there is a new statement up on my website, which is detailing all of the work that I've been doing. So everything from advocating for Red Cross to have access to those people that are still being held hostage to do a welfare check, through to talking about what may be possible to ensure that we are in no way contributing to the war efforts as a nation. Please take a look at it. Also in Parliament, a complete change of course, but I had the chance to talk about two things that are really important to our community. The first of it is public education. So Willoughby Girls High School celebrated their 90th birthday on the weekend between sitting weeks. I was very fortunate to attend their celebrations. It was a pretty amazing thing to be a part of. So I raised those celebrations in Parliament House. And then immediately upon my return, I actually got to go to Redlands to celebrate their 140th anniversary, which is pretty amazing considering both of those educational institutions started as women's schools for women. So it's been interesting to see how long those schools have continued to operate and how successful they've been. I then also spent some time with the Year 9 students at Redlands. I did that only on Tuesday this week, actually talking to them about the role government plays in shaping our economy, which was quite timely given the extraordinary moves we've seen the opposition make in the last 4 or 5 days as it relates to what our economy should look like in the future when it comes to renewable energy as a focus. I also just want to touch very briefly on the fact that I'm aware that the opportunity classes that are currently offered at Artarmon, the numbers there have currently been flagged to be decreased. That is something that really concerns me because I know I've seen my kids go through school in this area now. My youngest is in year 11, and I know how important those opportunity classes are at Artarmon Public. I'm looking at what I can do to advocate for the Opportunity Classes program to grow overall, rather than for places to be created at other schools at the expense of existing schools. So again, watch this space. Also, while I was in Parliament, I took the opportunity to talk about our community's distress about the unacceptable level of aircraft noise, particularly across the Hunters Hill and Boronia Park region. And I called on the Minister, the Federal Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government to commission a review into the current airport operating principles. The truth is there is a long-term operating plan here, which was developed over 25 years ago, that is meant to lay out for Sydney Airport how noise levels can be shared equally and fairly across the Sydney Basin. That plan, when it comes to noise sharing, is currently not being followed. In fact, it was used less than 0.2% of the time in the last 12 months. So if you're living in one of those areas and you're feeling like the aircraft noise has increased, it has. I can tell you it has. You are not going crazy. And I am now working with the Minister, Air Services, Sydney Airport Authority, and using my seat on the Sydney Airport Community Forum to try and exert the pressure to do a formal review in what is actually going on and whether it could be better managed. In Parliament, I was really lucky to have a number of ministerial briefings and meetings that included everybody from Matt Thistlethwaite looking at defence oversight in our country and the establishment of a new parliamentary committee to oversee defence, through to Tanya Plibersek, multiple meetings on nature reform. Julie Collins, I met with her about small business payment terms reforms. Murray Watt on export control around the measures to ban live sheep export. Jason Clare about education reform. We got a win, as you all know, in terms of the HECS reform, but it's a very small win in that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there in terms of changing the date that indexation is applied. And looking at the fees that some people have incurred because of the change in fee structure under the prior government. Amanda Rishworth in social services area, I have a lot of contact with and continuing to do work with her both in broad social services and women's safety. And Stephen Jones, who is the Assistant Treasurer. Just a heads up, there is a Treasury reform bill coming into the House in the next little while, which is an absolute Frankenstein of a bill. So in the one piece of legislation, it's incredibly problematic because it seeks to cover everything from consumer protections for buy now, pay later, through to build to rent incentives, the instant asset write-off for small businesses, a Medicare levy exemption on lump sum payments, country by country reporting for multinational companies, and a list of entities that have achieved DGR status. So I have registered our deep distress as an electorate that we would have a treasurer put forward a piece of legislation like that, because arguably every single pieces of that deserve to be debated on their own merit. Tony Burke has been great in giving us updates on what's happening around Creative Australia, and the CEO for NDIS, Liz Elliott, actually reached out to me to thank me for North Sydney's advocacy to see funding provided to the NIDA. Did I say NDIS before? I meant NIDA. So NIDA reached out to say thanks to North Sydney for backing us in, and also met with Mike Butler around the new pharmacy agreement, because I know that's something that's important for our community, with a number of local pharmacists really feeling the pinch. During the sitting weeks, the other thing that we really got to celebrate was the fact that, wait for it, Wendy's Secret Garden, that has been promised DGR status over the last 15 years by multiple governments, has finally achieved DGR status in no short efforts, because the amazing Rachel Rogers in my team did not give up. Talk about a dog with a bone. She was able to negotiate to bring council to where we needed to be, to get the team behind Wendy's Secret Garden to where we need to be. So we may have played a small role in finally getting that charitable status through, but God damn it, we played a role and we played it well, and we finally have it. So well done to the team. So just a final bit in the last 2 minutes, a quick watch out, what to watch out for in the next couple of weeks. So the week started with a bang, and in my notes here, I've actually got, I came out swinging in the face of the opposition's announcements. Unbelievably, we saw Peter Dutton come out on Saturday saying that an opposition government would walk away from the 43% carbon emissions reduction target by 2030. As I would expect, you would expect me to do, I have come out very hard saying that not only is that illogical, because at the moment our modelling has us hitting 42% against a 43% target, I actually think it's marginally criminal, and that I think that it actually is, it is negligent, and it's deliberate negligence on the part of the opposition. So I think what's disappointing is I think we all felt that we had moved beyond the climate wars, and that we finally had embraced the opportunities that present themselves with a green economy. What Peter Dutton and his Liberal colleagues and his National colleagues have shown us in the last 3 or 4 days is they are not interested in moving forward into a new economy. They are very happy still standing side by side with their fossil fuel mates, and they would rather distract us with a conversation around nuclear, which even by their own admission will not come into play until 2040. So I think there's going to be a lot of conversation in that space going on. And I just want to draw it back to the single, beyond the climate benefits, beyond the economic benefits, beyond the education benefits, and the benefits for future generations. The single biggest thing we could do to reduce cost of living right now is get every single Australian onto their own energy source. by empowering them to have access to solar panels. Now, I know that's going to be harder for some people than others, particularly if you live in a strata block or if you rent rather than own. But the truth of the matter is the opposition trying to sell us a gig that nuclear is going to be cheaper in 2040, when we can actually provide really cheap energy to Australians tomorrow if we're mobilised in the right way. It's really underhanded, and yeah, it just says to me that the opposition has not bothered to actually listen to us, given the results that we got in the 2022 election. Tomorrow night, we've got a fantastic event happening in the lectorate with a group called Together for Humanity, which is an organisation which sounds like it's the punchline or the setup of a joke, in that it literally was a rabbi, an imam, and a Roman Catholic priest who came together to set up an organisation to champion harmony across the community. So that invitation-only event is happening tomorrow night in North Sydney, and it is designed to help people who are heavily involved in other community organisations at the moment facilitate harmony across the community. I'm also speaking tomorrow morning at the Nature Conservation Council breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning, talking about the importance of an economic mindset as we step into environmental reform. And then the big news this week on Friday will be the Australian Electoral Commission will announce the new boundaries on Friday, sometime, we think, between 12:30 and 1. So watch this space. If you're on the newsletter database, you will receive a newsletter from me via email that afternoon. And then there'll be a number of things depending which way it goes. But I feel like it's an exciting time in our seat. We are continuing to make a difference in terms of strengthening the legislation that moves through our parliament. And I think ultimately we're continuing to make a difference because we are an independent voice in what is an environment that is very bound up when it comes to constraint and towing the line traditionally between the two major parties. So as always, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be that voice. Thank you for turning up here tonight. And I'm not sure if there was anything in the chat. It doesn't look like there are any questions there. So on that basis, I'm going to go let everybody check their ovens and their stovetops or their toasters, and I'm going to go home and prepare my children's dinner. I look forward to seeing you all really soon. Thanks, guys. Oh, don't forget, there is an event. If you're a volunteer, we have an incredible volunteers event next Wednesday on the 19th. So it'd be lovely to see as many people there as possible, because that'll be our first real opportunity to actually talk about what the boundary redistribution might mean for us. So it'd be lovely to see you there. Okay, guys, have a great night. See you.